I was blessed with having a wonderful childhood, and there were many reasons for that. One of the elements that made my childhood so special was that for the first 12, 13 years of my life, I had a childhood best friend. Now, he and I spent almost every waking moment with one another. If I was in his house, he was at mine. We went to school together. We went to church together. Our houses were 4 blocks from one another. If he went on a vacation, I often went with him. If I went to my grandparents, he sometimes went with me. His parents were like second parents to me, and his grandparents were like second grandparents to me. And I don't ever remember us getting into an argument in 13 years. In fact, a lot of people said, if you want to know where Brian is, just find Jason. And if you want to know where Jason is, just find Brian. We were really inseparable, and in many respects, Jason was my right arm. Once a lady told my mom she didn't think it was a good idea that Jason and I spent so much time together. Not that she had any reason for that. She just said, I can't understand that a kid would have healthy friendships if they're spending all their time with one person. I mean, you talk about insecurity. If you've ever had a best friend or even a childhood best friend, you know that they are worth all the money in the world. Well, through no control or fault of ours, our friendship took a turn and it never recovered. It was the day that Jason and his family moved away, and our lives took on 2 different paths. Jason moved far, and the church that we attended wasn't the same for me. The school that we attended wasn't the same. The neighborhood wasn't the same. Again, I had just lost my right arm. And for a while, I didn't really know how to function because we had spent so much time together. Now, as God would have it, over the course of my life, I have got and maintained a lot of friends, a lot of good friends, some best friends. But Jason was something very, very special and irreplaceable. When we see each other, which is not as often as either one of us would like, we really just pick up where we left off. There's no awkwardness. We sort of catch up on life, and then it goes right back to when we were best friends. One of the greatest friendships like that in all the Bible is, of course, the portrayal of the friendship of David and Jonathan that really is amplified in our story today in 1 Samuel chapter 28. They meet, they devise a plan, they meet again, and after chapter 20, their friendship, through no fault of their own and beyond their control, really is never the same. In fact, after this chapter, they will meet one another one other time, and that will be it. It's a rather sad story filled with a lot of emotion. And it's certainly a chapter by which we can glean aspects of good, solid friendship. And I do believe that friendship is a gift from God, Jesus himself being our friend. I think having legitimate, authentic friendships is a rare commodity in this fake friend, inauthentic, artificial friend society. So if you get one, you've got something very, very special. Certainly this chapter talks about it, but deeper, it really once again talks about the work of God in the lives of these 2 wonderful men. The story begins as a continuation of chapters 18 and 19. David gets together with Jonathan, and he really tells him what the problem is. Right out of the gate, In verse 1, he says, "Your dad, Jonathan, keeps seeking my life." Now, this is, of course, a continuation of chapters 18 and 19, where Saul, at least a dozen times, tried to kill David. And it got rather comical as his plan is foiled over and over again. When we last left Saul at the end of chapter 19, he was lying stark naked, face down, blabbering gibberish as a prophecy. You would think that after he got up and came to his senses, he would say, "Okay, if you can't beat him, join him. I've tried hard to get David, ain't gonna work, I'm done. You won, David." But that doesn't happen. According to David's present tense here in verse 1, Saul keeps coming after him. And David realizes that Saul will lay aside governing his kingdom. He will lay aside advancing opposing armies against Israel to see that David is pushing up daisies. He is completely obsessed, consumed with the murder of David. And once again in chapter 20, we're told why. So David's problem that he's confessing to Jonathan is, your dad wants to kill me. Now, David asks a question to follow this up that probably you or I have asked if we have ever been the victim of someone that doesn't like us, someone that's out to get us, someone that takes joy in our demise. We ask what David asks. What have I done? What sin have I committed that would make him hate me so? Now, this may not in any way cause Saul's anger to kindle, but it would at least give David some rational understanding of why Saul is willing to assassinate this kid who liberated Israel from the Philistines. Jonathan, though, does something that I think every good friend does in his reply to David. He wants to settle him down. He wants to calm him down. Obviously, Jonathan sees that David is agitated, that he's upset, and why wouldn't he be? He's been the victim of an assassination attempt repeatedly. So Jonathan does what I think every good friend does. Let's calm down. And he says this by saying, look, my dad doesn't want to kill you, David. Besides, look, my dad doesn't do anything unless he confides in me first. I am his confidant, his concierge. I'm his chief counselor. Now, that may be a bit of a stretch for Jonathan to say that. After all, I'm not sure that Saul consulted with Jonathan when he threw a spear at David. But nevertheless, Jonathan's attempt is to calm him down. David, though, doesn't allow that to comfort him. He replies back, look, Jonathan, I understand what you're saying, but your dad knows that we're best friends. Your dad knows you have a soft spot in your heart for me. Your dad knows that we're blood brothers. So he's going to, probably on purpose, withhold some information, withhold some plans about me so that you don't come and give it away. Then Jonathan follows that up with another attribute, I think, of a good friend. He simply says, how can I help? He understands that his argument is not getting through to David, that David is still upset, and so Jonathan doesn't push it. He says, you tell me, what can I do to help you in this situation? Again, while the main point of this chapter is not moral lessons about friendship, they nevertheless emerge. Jonathan and David certainly love and care for one another greatly. Curiously, David then appeals to Jonathan and explains why Saul is turning on him and what he hopes from Jonathan. He says this after hatching a plan in verses 5, 6, and 7. David tells Jonathan, okay, here's my plan. Here's one way we'll know that your dad is angry with me or not. And that plan is developed later. But in verse 8, interestingly, David reunites this covenant that started between them in chapter 18. And David uses a term that is used repeatedly throughout this chapter. Later, it becomes extremely significant in Old Testament theology as an attribute for God. Now, I will let Dr. Brewski, with his prowess and intellect, unpack the understanding of the word hesed. But Jonathan and David here uses it in verse 8 when he talks to Jonathan and says, you act kindly toward your servant, for into a covenant of Yahweh you have been brought, your servant with you. But if there's any guilt in me, you put me to death. David is reminding Jonathan, remember the covenant we made, the blood brother covenant we made back in chapter 18 to love one another forever? I want to remind you of that, to deal with me kindly. Now, I don't think David said that because he doesn't trust Jonathan. I think David said it because he knows they are in deep waters and their love for each other will be put to the test. For David's part, he will continue to be an outlaw. He will continue to flee from Saul. And the historian proves this. More content in 1 Samuel is dedicated to David's flight from Saul than there is David killing Goliath or David the shepherd boy. In fact, more stories about David in 1 Samuel are about David the outlaw, David the fleer, David the fugitive, David on the run, than in any other aspect of David's life. He knows that as long as he's alive and as long as Saul's alive, he will not rest easy each night. But he also knows, because of his relationship with Jonathan, that Jonathan also will forgo a stressful time, as he will be put under unbelievable stress and pressure from his father to relent, to turn David in, to betray him. And so David is asking this of Jonathan, remember our covenant one toward another and treat me with loving kindness. Curiously, in verse 12, Jonathan begins to understand the seriousness of David now. When David throws this reminder of covenant, now Jonathan's tone takes a more serious, somber path. He asks David, after hearing this plan and after listening to David make this promise again, Jonathan takes him out to a field with some arrows. Jonathan now hatches a plan by which he'll communicate David the results of David's plan. And as he does, he then gives a remarkable speech, a plea rather, to David. The speech here in verses 13, 14, and 15 is remarkable on at least three grounds. First, Jonathan admits that David will be king. He acknowledges it. He has no problem with it. But his speech is such that David is king, David being safe, is implied. Second, Jonathan now asks David to return the favor, and as king, that he will protect Jonathan's family. This is really remarkable given what Jonathan has done previously in chapter 18. Remember the first few verses, Jonathan takes off his robe, he takes off his armor, and he puts it on David as a symbolic transference of power. Monarchs and potential kings did not do that. They eliminated their competitors. They didn't transfer power. Now, David will do the same when he becomes king. When a newly crowned king came to the throne, former monarchs, living relatives should beware, because they would likely be hunted people, because the newly elected king would be sure to eliminate all its competitors to its throne. But David doesn't do this. In fact, in 2 Samuel, early chapters, there is a campaign to kill off Jonathan's children, but David doesn't do this. He remembers this speech. So Jonathan implies and acknowledges David will be king. He asks for the same type of covenant that David asks from him, that he treat his children with loving kindness, with hesed. And third, for the first time in the Bible, something emerges here that will now run its course throughout the Old Testament and into the New. For the first time, someone acknowledges David's global kingdom. This, of course, will later become a credential of the Messiah. Remember, the Messiah will sit on David's throne, ruling his enemies. This understanding of David's international reach comes not from a systematic theology class or a seminary course, but from a friend to a friend. This speech is absolutely remarkable. So that's the conversation. Saul is still hunting David. David hatches a plan which, for many of us, will not go without trouble. It's sort of the same type of deception that we had in chapter 19, and Rahab does with the Israelite spies. And then Jonathan tells David he'll hatch a plan to let David know. The next scene, beginning in verse 24, comes with a new moon banquet. Evidently, this was a monthly gathering where people would celebrate, and we have now back to Saul's court. He sits at the royal table. His back is against the wall. Next to him is his relative and his captain of the guard, Abner. Across the table is his son and heir apparent, Jonathan. And a chair over, a vacant chair, is his son-in-law, the giant slayer, the great warrior, David. But David is nowhere to be found. Now, if you think about it, as my dad used to say, David can't win for losing. If he shows up, he's likely to be killed. There's a spear handy, we know, and Saul's anger is at a tip-top level. But by him not coming will incur the wrath of the king all the more, because you simply just didn't leave court without the permission, the pink slip of the king, and David had not received permission, but his chair is vacant. That first night, we're not told that there was any conversation. Saul didn't ask and make inquiries about where David's presence. The writer, though, of 1 Samuel eavesdrops into the thoughts of Saul, where Saul tells himself that surely this kid is in sin. He's unclean, and that's why he doesn't come. Now, I find this fascinating that insane people, that nut people that are delusional, trying to murder others, will try to justify their actions. He's in sin, everyone knows it. Night number 2 of the festival comes, and once again, David is a no-show. Here, Saul inquires. His inquiry, if you'll notice the text, is rather derogatory. 3 times he refers to David, not as David, not the giant slayer, not the shepherd boy, but simply the son of Jesse, which is, I think, a way to hit below the belt, this riffraff from a low-income family. Where is he? Jonathan, in accordance to his and David's plan, begins his speech. David asks if he could go to Bethlehem to share in this meal and this sacrifice with his family. I said it was fine. Then Saul blows his top. You can almost sense that it was bubbling. And he calls his son, his blood a very bad name. I don't need to press it. You could read the text, and we live in the 21st century, and we hear this sort of talk, this foul speech, but Saul calls his own son this and goes off on him about being a divinic protector, and who does he think he is? And Jonathan tries to reason with his dad, but you can't reason with crazy. Saul then rebuts a very interesting line, "You and your kingdom." Don't you understand? David is trying to rob you and your kingdom. So Saul is vexed and content to go on a killing campaign with David because David is a threat to his dynasty. What is remarkable is the very next action of Saul goes against that dynasty as he picks up a spear and throws it at the heir apparent of his name, his own son. Jonathan does something remarkable. He gets up, he leaves his father's presence without asking to leave, and he does it without eating. All the way down the palace hall, Jonathan may have been thinking, David's right about my dad. If my dad is willing to kill his own son, then he's willing to kill David as a threat. The next scene and the final scene goes from meeting to the table to the field. Here we're told that Jonathan, beginning in verse 35, brings a young boy out into the field. This is a clever ploy because Saul may have confederates following Jonathan. Also, the boy acts as a great decoy. If the boy goes back to town and he is interrogated by Saul, maybe he's bribed, then he can say, "I saw nothing. We were just doing target practice," and he would have been correct. The idea of this plan, as David and Jonathan hatched earlier, was if Saul inquired about David and Jonathan said he's in Bethlehem giving an offering, and Saul said, "This is great, that's nice, it's okay," then that would be the signal that everything was fine, David could come back to court. Jonathan was to signal that this was the case by shooting arrows in a field below the young men within easy reach access and yell that out. But if Saul was vexed at David, if Saul was, as David surmised, out to kill him, then Jonathan would give this signal by shooting beyond the young man and yelling out, "The arrows are beyond you." This was a clever plan. David is lying in wait in some rocks like a gopher huddled out in a hiding place, waiting for this moment to happen. And then it does. The young boy trots off. Jonathan says, "Go collect the arrows that I'll shoot." And you wonder, had I been a fly on one of the bushes or one of the prairie grass that afternoon, you wonder what Jonathan and David must have been thinking. Jonathan was a crack shot, but did he grit his teeth? Did he have to dry up his tears to make an accurate fire? One of my favorite Western series, actually, called The Hatfields and the McCoys, starring Kevin Costner and Bill Paxton. And Kevin Costner plays the character of Devil Anse Hatfield. There is a scene where the Hatfields have captured the McCoys, who have killed some of their kin. They've taken them out in the woods to do vigilante justice. They've tied them up in a tree, and a firing squad of about 12 men are lined up. Most of these guys are not assassins. They're not wanting to kill. And Devil Anse senses this, that they're actually tender and human. And so he says before he gives the signal to fire, "Boys, harden your hearts." I wonder that afternoon if it was raining or the sun was shining, if there was blue skies or cloudy. if Jonathan had to harden his heart to fire that arrow. The fletching, the notching, the arrowhead struck the ground and it descended in the air like a quarterback's Hail Mary. David saw it in flight, no doubt. It kept carrying, it kept carrying, it kept carrying. And like the bearer of bad news, David might be thinking, surely he's misfired. But David is a crack shot, and he takes out another arrow, and they all reach their intended target. I don't know if you've ever sat around on pins and needles waiting for a call that could be good news or bad news. Your stomach's churning, you're pacing, wondering when the call will come in and what the deliverance will be. No doubt as David sat in those rocks, wondering what the news was, and Jonathan breaks the silence on that prairie when he tells that boy, those arrows are beyond you. Go quickly. Get out and get them quickly, which was more of a code to David than it was the errand boy. The boy does his duty, retrieves the arrows, and Jonathan gives him both bow and arrow and says, I'll see you back in town. Once the coast is clear, Jonathan and David have an endearing moment together. As I said before, they will, after this occasion, see each other briefly only one time, and then it's all over. You get the sense that not only on that day was there sharp arrows and blinding tears, but there was a long goodbye between these two friends. Through no fault of their own, beyond their control, their friendship is coming to an end. David is a master poet. You and I go to David when our hearts are crushed and we need to be comforted, inspired, encouraged, or exhorted to praise. David writes so many psalms about his time running from Saul, running from Absalom, running from sin. He writes so many psalms of adoration of God's deliverance and his achievement of victory. If David wrote a psalm about this moment, we'll never know because it's not in Scripture for us. Sometimes we go through life, I am convinced, where hearts are heavier than words can express. I think it's one of those times. As David makes the first move, there are 3 examples of posturing here in these last few verses. David makes the first one. Out in that field where no one can see, he approaches Jonathan, who will never sit on a king's throne, who will never have a royal diadem bracing his brow, who will never be the heir apparent of the throne of Israel, now gets a king's devotion as David puts himself to the ground and bows 3 times before Jonathan, his friend. This performance is the exact symbol, the exact posture one does before one's king. Jonathan gets up, or David gets up rather, and we learn that there is embracing and there is crying. But as we read here in the last few verses, that David cries all the more. If you lose a friend through no fault of yours and his, beyond your control, a good friend, you weep. When my friend Jason moved away, he got sick, got headaches in the succeeding months of our departure, and I cried a lot, which is funny because when we were together, Jason did the crying, you know. He got picked on, he got beat up, and I had to finish it for him. But when our relationship was severed, I cried a lot. When one of my best friends died, my father, I asked my mom and my sister the day we went to the funeral home if I could get a minute or a few by myself. They thought that was a little perplexing, probably, because I knew I'd be slobbering and crying like a baby, and I needed to. I wasn't comfortable doing it in front of anyone because my dad was one of my best friends. And this is what you do when friends are being separated. I think Jonathan and David knew that, and David wept all the more. Jonathan gets the last word and says to David, "Go in peace. We have sworn an oath in Yahweh's name, saying, may Yahweh be between me and you, and between my seed and your seed forever." Now, only a Christian understands that. Only someone who has made a covenant with God himself, to him be our God and we be his people forever and ever, and have his loving kindness shine upon us. Only someone knows that. Because you might say, how can they say be at peace when David and Jonathan aren't at peace? Their friendship is being broken up because Jonathan has a nut father trying to kill his best friend. But a Christian knows that they can sing, "When peace like a river attends my soul," and then sing the next line, "When sorrows like sea billows roll." How is this possible? How is it possible that a Christian can have all sorts of hurt and betrayal and disappointment and heartache in this world and still be at peace? Jonathan and David's relationship, it wasn't blue skies and purple horseshoes and pink bunnies and flamingos and these wonderful things. No, David was still an outlaw. Jonathan was going to be severed from him, and yet Jonathan could say, because of God and our covenant with him, we can be at peace. Jesus told us, in this world, you'll have tribulation. It's going to be heavy. It's not going to be a cakewalk, but my peace I give to you. This is exactly the kind of teaching the Apostle Paul meant to encourage the Church of Rome, who was going through their own persecution, when in Romans chapter 5, verse 1, Paul said that Christians enjoy peace even when facing afflictions. Why is that? Because the Lord God sent his covenant to us, that he would bestow his loving kindness on us forever, though come what may. Though come what may. And that contract, that promise, that covenant was the price of the shed blood of his only begotten Son, Jesus, who Paul says in Ephesians becomes our peace as we are reconciled back to God. And now you and I, through Jesus and only through Jesus, have a covenant with this God that he will always bestow loving kindness. That's what makes us say, like the hymn writer, "It is well with my soul. Though sorrows and sea billows roll, it's peace like a river because of Jesus." This is why you and I as Christians, every Lord's Day, at least here at this church, when we're able, take the Lord's Supper and we remember the words, "This is the blood of my covenant given for you." Never forget that God in his loving kindness gives us and grants us peace. The final scene is poignant. Verse 42, "Then David rose up and went away, and Jonathan went into his town. But they were united because of that covenant of God's loving kindness. And so are we. Besides this lesson of peace, brothers and sisters, there is yet another lesson beyond friendship here. And that is, like David did, like Jonathan did, when we go through our own areas of less than ideal circumstances, your health breaks. You didn't see this trial coming. You're going through tremendous heartache. Your prayers aren't answered as quickly as they are. People are descending on you and wishing you ill will. Whatever it is, you pick your poison. What did both David and Jonathan do? They ran back to the Lord their God, and they championed his covenant with them, a covenant of loving kindness. When the going gets tough and life gets hard and circumstances are less than ideal and trials abound, go back to your God and remember the covenant that he issued so long ago on Calvary that still stands today, a God who will always love you no matter what happens. If you're here and you're listening and you're not a Christian, that can be yours free. The well is deep and his grace is free. And Jesus' work saves. You don't save yourself. That's why it's called grace. You don't earn it. He did it for you at the cross. And all you have to do is believe it and receive it. Years ago, there was a song penned by Michael W. Smith. Now, I'm a big Michael W. Smith fan. I started listening to him as a kid, and there are some songs that I remember where I was when I first heard them. And one of those songs is the one that I've recited many, many times in this pulpit, and we'll do it again. I love this song. It never gets old to me because it is not only an expression of my heart and who I am on my own outside of Christ, but thankfully the song also expresses his heart for me and for you by faith. The song is called Unloved, and as we close, I'd like to recite it to you. I have been unfaithful. I have been unworthy. I have been unrighteous, and I have been unmerciful. I have been unreachable. I have been unteachable. I have been unwilling, and I have been undesirable. Sometimes I have been unwise. I've been undone by what I'm unsure of. But because of you and all you went through, I know I have never been unloved. I have been unbroken. I have been unmended. I have been uneasy. I have been unapproachable. I have been unemotional. I have been unexceptional. I have been undecided. And I have been unqualified. Unaware. I have been unfair. I've been unfit from blessings from above. But even I can see the sacrifice you made for me to show me that I have never been unloved.